Hello and welcome to the BRR Legal Brief, where we bring you the latest legal issues affecting corporate Australia. I'm Kate Ritchie. With the election date being called 7.5 months out, both parties will have some time to put forward their policy platforms. And with the opposition already flagging some changes set to affect infrastructure. Joining me to discuss the potential implications for infrastructure projects is Stephen Mackay, who's a partner at Addisons. Stephen, thank you for joining me in the studio.
My pleasure, Kate.
Well, Stephen, firstly, what is the opposition proposing?
Well, it would be unusual for any opposition to propose that the current government has done a great job re-infrastructure, it's spent well, it's spent wisely. We've got lots of infrastructure and we don't really need any more. And this opposition certainly hasn't disappointed in that regard. They've got a dim view of what the current government's done, and they've got some very real ideas for what they propose to make things different. In a very general sense, Kate, they have three different sort of approaches to infrastructure. The first is an oldie but a goodie. It's just a direct spend. They're just going to spend money on particular infrastructure projects. So, in particular, road infrastructure, there'll be $1.5 billion spent on some road infrastructure in Sydney. The East-West Road Tunnel Link Road in Melbourne gets $1.5 billion. There's $1 billion towards the Gateway motorway in Brisbane. $400 million towards the duplication of the Midland Highway in Tasmania. $5.6 billion towards the duplication of the Pacific Highway from Newcastle in New South Wales up to the Queensland border. There's an unspecified amount towards some road infrastructure in both South Australia and Perth. But look, there's certainly a reasonable spend on infrastructure, particularly road infrastructure. So that's the first thing. They're going to spend some money on infrastructure. The second thing that the opposition proposes is to have better planning for infrastructure and also a more cost-effective approach to infrastructure, particularly for Commonwealth projects. So with planning, there'll be a 15-year rolling infrastructure plan for national projects. Infrastructure Australia will be required to carry out a cost-benefit analysis of all Commonwealth projects in excess of $100 million. Infrastructure Australia will also be required to work more closely with the opposition if they're elected. And also they'll be required to publish the reasons for why they've recommended a particular project. In addition, the Australian Building and Construction Commission, which had been abolished by the current government, will be reintroduced by the opposition, together with the National Code and some guidelines that many commentators, and I know Robert Godlebson is one of them, believe that the reintroduction of those things will reduce building costs for Commonwealth projects by anything up to 25% by weakening what commentators see as a union control over building sites. So if the first sort of element is direct spending, the second is very much around planning and more cost-effective spending for Commonwealth projects. The third element is probably the most general in one sense, but I find it the most interesting, and that relates to a number of general changes to the Australian economy, not targeted at infrastructure, but infrastructure will be one of the real beneficiaries, in my view, of these changes. Things like abolishing the mining tax, abolishing carbon tax, lowering the company tax rate, streamlining certain environmental approvals. Those changes will mean that projects which were uneconomic with those things in place become economic with those changes. There's another element to the changes which is also important to know in relation to infrastructure, and that really revolves around an increased perception internationally of Australia's sovereign risk when things like the mining tax were introduced. And if you're an investor, say you're in China and you've got a range of projects around the world to choose from, and you need to make an assessment of sovereign risk, Australia's a pretty safe destination traditionally. Don't have a lot of revolutions, civil wars, civil unrest. We have stable government, and we're long thought to have a reasonably stable sort of system of law. No rapid changes. Certainly the government came in for a reasonable amount of criticism in relation to increasing international perceptions of sovereign risk for investment in Australia with the introduction of the mining tax. You abolish the mining tax, then you go some way to correcting some of those perceptions. So those are sort of, in summary, Kay, those are sort of the three ways I would see the opposition proposing to do things to affect infrastructure. Direct spend, better planning and some more cost-effective analysis of Commonwealth spending, and then the more indirect but I think quite powerful approach of reducing certain taxes, streamlining approvals and reintroducing the Commission some guidelines and code which will reduce costs for Commonwealth projects.
And Stephen, how do you see these plans as comparing with what we have under the current government?
Well, Kate, look, sometimes in elections, what is proposed by the government and what's proposed by the opposition is really very similar. Sometimes you have to really get into the nuances of what each is proposing to determine the true differences. This is not one of those times. You've got a government which has introduced the carbon tax, has introduced the mining tax, has abolished the Commission. You've got an opposition which proposes to reintroduce the Commission, to abolish the carbon tax, to abolish the mining tax. So they're really at polar extremes in terms of particular things. So I won't say that what the opposition is proposing is a radical change historically. It just puts us back into the position that we were before the government changed the things they've changed.
Well, if the opposition does get into power and they do make these changes, do you think the changes are likely to be welcomed by industry?
I think the way you phrase the question is really good. If the opposition does these things, if they don't do these things, it's just rhetoric. They must do these things. But if they do them, I think it will be welcomed. I think in particular by people in infrastructure and by people in resources. They'll welcome these changes because they'll reduce the perception of sovereign risk. They will make projects in Australia more attractive to private investment, to foreign investment. They will reduce the cost of Commonwealth projects. It will be good to have a national plan for infrastructure projects. So I think that they will be welcomed. These projects, Kate, they've got a massive lead time. If you're a junior iron ore miner in Western Australia and you've got a deposit, iron's not that uncommon. 4% of the Earth's crust or 5% of the Earth's crust is iron, and it's the fourth most abundant element in the Earth's crust. So it's not a rare thing, but getting it to market is not easy. You need to build kilometres of rail track. You need to have a port. These projects cost billions of dollars and have a big lead time. So if you're someone in that position, you really are going to welcome these changes because you're going to be far better able to attract investment in those sort of projects, which often goes into the billions, and foreigners are very interested in what we have in our ground.
Well, Stephen, you mentioned attracting investment, but what do you see as some of the other implications of these changes on infrastructure projects?
I think that for infrastructure projects generally, I am attracted to the better planning. One of the challenges that the opposition will have, not because of anything in particular that they've proposed, but just it's the way our country's set up with our federal government and the state governments, is that no matter how well intentioned it is, no matter how good the 15-year rolling infrastructure plan of national projects is, it might be the best plan in the world, but they're going to need to have the cooperation of the states for some of it. Okay, so let's say Australia's an island. We've got a lot of seaborne trade. Our ports are important to us. But the ports are still, to this day, largely controlled by state authorities. So it's all very well for the opposition, if they get in, to come up with a great idea in relation to Australia's ports. But unless they get the cooperation of all of the state governments, then it might just remain just a great idea.
Well, some interesting insights there, and certainly everyone will be waiting to see what does happen with the election later in the year. Stephen, thank you so much for your insights today.
My pleasure.
And viewers, of course, thank you as well, and we hope that you can join us next week for our legal brief.